Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. We're starting 3 minutes late, and I draw everybody's attention to that. If I could have silence. I draw everybody's attention to that because as co-moderator with Igor Jürgens, I am very aware that time is not on our side. We have almost a dozen distinguished speakers, each of whom I would happily give half an hour. But instead I'm going to give them 5 minutes. And I'm going to interrupt quite brutally when the 5 minutes are up, even if they're in mid-sentence. And just to set the scene from my point of view, Igor knows much more about EU-Russia relations than I do, but I'm a Brussels-based think tanker and journalist, and I've been there for 40 years, so I have the perspective of history. And what I want to say is this: I don't think we should be looking at Greater Europe. I think we've looked at Greater Europe for decades, and it has got us nowhere. In fact, we're going backwards in the relationship between Russia and the European Union. What I would like to say is, today marks the day when China and America sign their trade deal. Don't be fooled. The major geopolitical shift in our world is a more aggressive unilateralist America and a rapidly expanding China. My question is, where does that leave Russia and the European Union? To what extent are we going to be forced to collaborate, forced to choose between the Chinese and the Americans? And what sort of European-Russian relationship does that portend? So I've explained my brutality, explained my prejudice, and I now hand over to Igor, and then Igor will call upon Russian speakers. I will call upon non-Russian speakers.
Спасибо большое. Большое честь и удовольствие.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor for me to be a co-moderator with Giles. I am limited to a couple of minutes only. Today we are gathering for the second time. Last year we gathered in approximately the same audience and we were discussing similar topics. But today there is more room in the geopolitical space, if I may put it so. There is light at the end of the tunnel in terms of the Ukrainian issue that was bringing down our relationships, but at the same time we see lots of challenges in the context of the Greater Europe. There are many conflicts that call for our close cooperation. Very soon in Berlin, our leaders will get together in order to discuss the Libyan crisis. They continue the consultation on the Syrian crisis, and this perimeter has become even more tense after the events in Iran. The cooperation is getting better, but we still do not see distant prospect. We do not see what will be the position of Europe towards what is happening in Asia and in the US, let alone Africa. We've already said that we are going to be strict in terms of timing, and we are going to call upon all the speakers. And in terms of speakers, I can say, at least for the Russian speakers, that we can see here today in this room the best experts. They are the best experts in terms of relationships between Russia and Europe. And now It is a great honor to me to give the floor to the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation, Alexander Grishko. He has been dealing with these issues of foreign affairs throughout his whole professional life. Thank you very much, dear co-moderators. I would like to use my time in order to present you my deliberations on the matters of the Greater Europe. Indeed, people who think and try to discuss the matter of the Greater Europe usually think about three main areas. First of all, the essence of this project, the Greater Europe, and Mr. Jurgens has rightly said that first of all we need to understand what Europe wants in terms of its relationships with Russia and other centers, and then we will see how we can develop these relationships, because we are living in a very dynamically developing environment. It is true. And now I have to state quite simply that the world has become very complicated and very dynamic. It is developing rapidly. We are seeing many new economic and political centers being shifted and being reinforced. They're shifting towards Asia, and the West is becoming weaker. Right now, the West is playing a role of this factor which is forming the Asian environment. The US is trying to stand by its positions in terms of and in the environment of new challenges. They are implementing the protectionist measures, and they are putting the stake not on cooperation, not on reinforcing the relationships with their neighbors, but they are trying to isolate themselves, and they are trying to reinforce their security using the circumstances that they have. That is the political reality that we see when specific states are trying to turn the situation to their advantage. Speaking about the rule-based approach, unfortunately, it is abused now in order to disrupt the existing world order. The rule-based approach is not, unfortunately, adhered to by the inventors of that concept. And unfortunately, this kind of policy can only bring short-term results. In the long-term prospect, it is going to promote the players who are investing all their efforts to defend their individual position, their special role on the international arena. It is obvious that we have to come up with a new approach to the international relations. It has to uphold the norms of the international law. It has to uphold all the mechanisms for protecting and providing for the international stability, and it has to combat financing terrorism, proliferation, and climate change. As of today, we see that the West and the Western discourse is trying to put aside the question of building the Greater Europe till better times, but we actually perceive this position as trying to distract us from reality in order to rearrange the interactions between the main players of that playing field. When we see that systematic approach is absent and the corresponding mechanisms are absent, they have not been created, and I'm not going to list all the reasons right now, we see that instead of the systematic approach and the system-building mechanisms, new alliances are coming. These alliances know their goals and their tasks very well. The Astana format, the format that we see in terms of the Libyan issues, this format gives us new opportunities to bring together our forces, to bring together our efforts in order to continue working without hidden agenda, without secondary agenda. This is a very good example of how we can go away from the known ideological positions and look at the reality. We need to see that today we cannot be creating islands of security and wealth. All that is in the past. The world has changed. The same goes for Russia-European Union relationships. Today's relationships are very clear. Unfortunately, the relationships are far from being satisfactory. The European Union, unfortunately, is not using proper principles in terms of building its relationships with Russia. And we see more and more signs of the fact that foreign organizations are interested, in fact, in cooperation with Russia. If we look at all the contacts and all the communications in terms of intergovernmental relationships, we will see that Russia is one of the major partners in terms of finding solutions to global conflicts and situations. Unfortunately, Russia is not a major partner in terms of the economic relationships. In 2014, the total volume of the economic turnover used to be 14 billion euros, and the overall turnover, in fact, could be, if the relationships had been better, amounting to $500 to $550 billion, like that between US and China, for example. It is $600 billion. Because the relationships between Europe and Russia is comparable in terms of its volume and its importance to cooperation between other big global centers. The foreign trade amount between Russian Federation and the EU accounts for 42% right now. The best result we saw in the past was 51%. And Europe is still one of the biggest partners of Russia. Going back to Europe, I'd like to say that we have to take into consideration current circumstances. Of course, they call upon creating a new political and economical space from Lisbon to Vladivostok, and in order to make that happen, we need to build new cooperations and communications between Eurozec. This organization has become a reality, and it's become very interesting for many other centers of power, and there are many examples of partnerships that are happening from Serbia to Singapore in Asia. Of course, we have to understand that we need to build and develop this process in line with other projects like One Belt, One Way, for example. Another thing is that today we have to come up with the solutions for totally new tasks, totally new issues that we are seeing today. These are new issues for all the countries, for European countries as well. All the new technologies, 5G, decarbonization, the green agenda, the necessity to combat new risks and threats come over the instability and risks in the enhanced conflict area zones. We can try and solve these tasks ourselves and find solutions ourselves, marking new borderlines and demarcation lines. But at the same time, we can opt for trying to find a common solution together based on the multilateral cooperation. And we know that the cooperation in this area will be critically important for both Russia and the European Union. That is why it is so important to take part in the Greater Europe project, considering and provided that all the other partners act accordingly.
It's very difficult to cut a minister off in his own country, in his own forum. But I was tempted to remind you, Alex, time is very short. And I'm going to remind that to Giulio Tremonti, very distinguished former 3 times finance minister in Italy, I think. But Mr. Tremonti, I saw a draft of your remarks. I hope we can tear them up and you will speak off the cuff.
Thank you.
You have 5 minutes.
What is past is a prologue, Shakespeare, The Tempest. What's past is engraved on the front of the building of the National Archives in Washington. We in Europe, we have a lot of different national archives, but we have not an European archive yet. In any case, the history of European Union is a very short history, 30 years. 30 years ago, for Europe was a triumph, the triumph of our civil values and of our political ideals, but jointly, as an effect of globalization, was the origin of the present European crisis. Not Europe entering globalization, but globalization entering Europe, finding Europe enchanted and unprepared. 30 years ago, the dominant idea was we have jointly the duty, the opportunity to export in the new global world our model. Was both an illusion and a terrible mistake, the Union becoming victim of its own hubris. The market unified in Europe is not the unique market in the world. And in any case, market is only a part of life. A lot of terrible mistakes produced by the dogmatic vision of Brussels. And I remember my opposition inside the Eurogroup. Every year, 10 linear kilometers of new European regulation from the market to the life of people, an excess of bureaucracy. The antitrust regulation was a suicide. We removed immediately duties and quotas, and not in other parts of the world. The public role in the economy was excluded, sufficient the free market. Migration, at that time, the idea was the solution of our problems, not a problem by itself. The world crisis was introduced in the treaties only in 2012, after crisis. The an excess of transfer of powers from the financial area to the political area. The present architecture of the monetary structure in Europe is Picasso style, where debt is instead capital, inflation is a target, unreachable. Zero rates, remember Karl Marx, zero rates are the end of capitalism. At the end, Brexit. In Brussels, they are optimistic. In compensation of the UK, we can extend our presence to Balkans. Not a lucky case. Seriously losing the Anglosphere, Europe is losing the seas, essential in the confrontation between USA and China. In Brussels, they say we are still present at the table. It depends on which position, sitting around the table or being written as a dish on the menu. Europe and Russia. Honestly, our relationship are critical. I remember the accession of Russia to G8. I remember well practically Mare. After, now it's quite the opposite. From the Western side, the tendency to export democracy. I understand what can be considered politically correct, but I also know that democracy is not a commodity that can be exported McDonald's style. From the Russian side, honestly, a certain revanchism from Syria today to Libya. In any case, according to Shakespeare, we cannot ignore the past and the historical structure of our relationship. A new point. We have a new reason for a better relationship between Europe and Russia, China. Once it was said that Russia borders with whatever it wants. Now it's like that, but not for Russia. It is for China, which tries to border with whoever. This could be a new good reason for enforcement of our relationship. How to conclude? There is a saying which comes from the old time of the Cold War, a saying that can be now updated. At that time, it was said in Moscow, no one knows what is happening, but everyone understands it. Today in Brussels, everyone knows what is happening, but no one understands it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. A very fitting note on what's happening in Brussels. We're now going to Marcus Eder of the EU's ambassador here in Moscow.
Well, thank you, Giles, and thank you, Igor, for having me. Giulio gave me actually a great introduction because now you expect me to explain what nobody understands. But, you know, I'm just a poor ambassador. Maybe answering to the question, I think Greater Europe is, I would compare it to a construction site which is not being attended these days, and Giles has given a couple of reasons. We live in an age of global decoupling, and I think we also see a degree of decoupling between Russia and the European Union. It started, and I would concede that to our Russian friends, earlier than 2014, but 2014 was, of course, a hiatus with the annexation of Crimea, the sanctions, and then a Russian policy of localization and economic autonomy is clearly a sign of decoupling, and not only Russia decoupling from the European Union, but also from what Alexander calls the West. I would put more than one question mark after the concept of the West, because I don't think it exists in the sense we have known it. Even if we wanted to go back to the well-known concepts of Lisbon to Vladivostok, the four spaces, I think we would be confronted with a number of problems. Even only between Russia and the European Union, I already mentioned Russia's economic policy. Would Russia really be ready, both politically but even more economically, to engage in a free trade agreement with the European Union? I would doubt it, because its market cannot sustain it, I believe. Would the European Union want to engage in a Greater Europe project with Russia as long as we see Russia not fully respecting its neighbors' territorial integrity? I think I leave the answer to you. And then, of course, we have China. And having served in China, I would fully agree that the big power game of today is the US versus China. Where does it leave us? I think geostrategically, it leaves us in a very uncomfortable space. If this is the United States and this is China, the most uncomfortable space is in between, because both will push and pull us and trying to make us allies, and can certainly speak for the European Union. So I think the ideal place, at least for the European Union, is out there. Maybe closer to the United States. The European Union cannot defend itself militarily without the United States, but certainly not in this uncomfortable middle space. It's up for Russia to choose, but right now I see Russia more here. Where is China? But this can be a matter of discussion. Now, as to the relationship, we, of course, and Charles has reminded me to talk about the new commission. We have a new commission. So in Russian, I would say, s Novym Godom, s Novej Komisji, s Novym Szczęściem. It is certainly too early to call what impact that may have, because I would suggest to you firmly that the EU will not, because of a change of a commission, change its policy. Changes in policy will be determined by other factors. I see a window of opportunity opening, as I have said throughout the last year now, but not only because of the new commission. We have seen a number of positive developments. Last year, Russia returning to the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, progress on the Minsk process, and we have also seen successful trilateral gas negotiations on future gas transit through Europe. So I think we built a basis of minimal trust where we prove to each other that we can do things together. I will certainly advocate in Brussels that we should use this window of opportunity. It takes two to tango, which is an old diplomatic saying. I usually receive not much of an answer if I ask the Russian side what it would be ready to do to improve the relationship, because and Alexander will not contradict me. The Russian side believes that all mistakes were made by Europe and we should correct ourselves, come back, and then we would have a relationship. It's not going to work that way. It is very clear. We would have to make steps towards each other. There is opportunities, as have been mentioned. The Libya crisis is an opportunity. Russia's acceptance of the climate, of the Paris Convention. Connectivity may be a new word for Greater Europe, but this Europe will not extend from Lisbon to Vladivostok. It will extend from Lisbon to possibly Shanghai, or as Sergei Lavrov says, from Lisbon to Jakarta. So we have to take into account the new realities. Counterterrorism has been mentioned. I think there is a number of issues where we can make progress, and by that improve the EU-Russia relationship, properly speaking. But I think we have to sit down seriously and look at a perspective of 5 years at least. 5 years, why? Because the Commission's life term is 5 years, and President Putin's mandate is also until 2024. And then we will have to decide whether we want to spend the next 5 years as the last 5 years, or whether we find a new formula. And the formula, I think, has to contain a number of elements. One is deconfliction. I think there's a number of issues where we could already see, or we are already in some kind of a conflictual situation or potential conflictual situation. You can look at geography, you can look at cyberspace, you can look at a number of things. A deconfliction as a stepping stone for having a more a more constructive relationship where we somehow find interest-based neighborliness relationship as opposed to what we have now, which is very much characterized by an absence of political dialogue. And I must also add that as far as the European Union is concerned, we stand by the rules-based order. For us, the rules-based order is international law, plus other rules which are not international law, such as at the OSCE, where we would also expect Russia to be more constructive, such as on the Vienna document or the structured dialogue. So, I mean, there's a number of opportunities. We have to seize them. I think at this abstract level, Alexander would agree with me, and I'll leave it there. And I think I kept my 5 minutes limit. Thank you.
Спасибо большое, господин посол. Вы очень хороший посол. Не надо.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. You are a very good ambassador. You are respected. You are loved by us. It is my pleasure to pass the floor on to Fyodor Lukyanov, who is a key player in the Valdai Forum, where the Russian president is the major and the key player. You are a major player. You also is the head of the Russian Defense Council. So you have the floor, Fyodor. Thank you. Thank you indeed. So having come here, I think I realized the in-depth concept of the organizers. The way our discussion is organized is a brilliant illustration of the international situation today. There's a nice table. There are clever, intelligent people sitting around this table who are talking about the concepts of the world, whereas there's a public who is standing in the corner, and there's no room for the public. They're just standing humbly behind our seats, although this discussion was supposed to be meant for the public. So this is the approach, the approach we have been indulging in. So we have been preoccupied with our elite role in the world affairs, and we give a chance to other people on the street, of lending us their ear. I further believe that the United States have been mentioned here as a player that have been trying to change the rules of the game. Whatever we may think of President Trump, we have to admit that President Trump has set a new tune in the world politics. And this tune will keep playing, irrespective of whether Trump be re-elected or not, or what may be happening in the United States. America first is becoming a versatile, a universal slogan. If the key player in the world plays that, he plays as he wishes, as he will, then others have no option but to follow this logic. And so America first is then turning into a slogan which sounds like everybody first. That was my first idea. The second one is that we need to find a new place for each of us in the world. And to do so, we need to understand of who we are. And Ambassador Ederer has justly mentioned that the forthcoming 5 years are most important, are of paramount importance indeed, because the 5 years is the mandate of the European Commission and Putin's mandate as president. However, it doesn't really matter of who's the head of the European Commission or, and I fear saying so, of who has Russia. What matters is that we have entered a phase of crucial change just because we have exhausted the previous model of development. And Russia has to rethink a lot of things we were guided by in the past, because we were previously guided by the paradigm of the collapse of the Soviet Union. Nostalgia is a thing of the past now. It has no reason to keep clinging to it anymore. And I believe that Europe needs to rethink its original integration model. And, well, the previous integration model has come to its completion, and it was a brilliant success. But it's over. We now have to rethink it and to offer new approaches to the reforming of the European Union. And whilst the two parties to this world of international relations have been immersed in their own thoughts, the world is taking a pause. Well, here's one other thing. We have worked so hard, starting from 1989 or 1994, and we need to make use of what we have elaborated, what we have come up with. I believe that this past experience is of no use now. We need to work together in a different fashion, in a different manner. And that will depend on what we think ourselves, how we identify ourselves. And number 4, we have to admit that perhaps today and for the foreseeable future, politicians will not be helping, will not be facilitating rapprochement. They will be preoccupied by themselves. So whatever may happen between the Russian Federation and the European Union will be happening without help from politicians, will be happening in spite of the political community. I believe that we overestimated the lobbying potential of the European business on the European policies. I believe that politicians are making decisions running counter to the political will, and they cannot do anything about it. I believe that the political the business community needs to find a way of circumnavigating some political fights, and it takes two to tango. Coming back to Ambassador Adra's metaphor, we may recall the Roaring Twenties, and it wasn't tango they played. They played foxtrot or Charleston or whatever. It also took two, but they had to be moving much faster than two tango dancers. Thank you so much.
Excellent. Thank you very much. We now go to Wolfgang Schüssel, who needs no introduction, I think, as a long-standing former Chancellor of Austria.
Thank you so much. First of all, I didn't prepare a speech, just throwing some ideas, eventually provocations, or food for thoughts into this excellent round of experts. I think we should admit that Russia and Europe will lack the abilities and the tools to be real superpowers. Russia has not the economic capability, and the European Union has not the military and foreign policy capability. But we could, if we work together, it could be quite interesting model. And it's true that the way how we cooperated in the past is no longer possible. This is de facto not a very functioning model. I think what Igor said at the very beginning, there are maybe a light of the end of the tunnel. Is it the train coming to us, or is it real light at the end of the tunnel? But I think there are some positive steps. The Minsk format, the election of Zelensky and his really desire to get something for a peaceful solution, the exchange of prisoners, the transit agreement between Russia and Ukraine, moderated by the European Commission. I think these are positive steps forward. And I think just an idea: why isn't the time ripe for Russia to take the next step? And it was originally proposed by Russia to organize a peacekeeping mission, either by the United Nations or the OSCE or together, whatever, to help really safe and free elections in the whole area, according to what is agreed already in the Minsk process, Steinmeier formula, etc. And at the end, of course, the return of the border control, Ukraine, etc. So I think this could be something which is de facto still one of the real stumbling blocks. Second, I think we have real common interest. Markus Ederer and also others already said it. This is the multilateral order. This is peace and keeping peace and stability. The Iran issue is of utmost importance. We both tried to keep the GCPOA in order, and I think there is now eventually the room to renew some efforts to get in touch with Iran. We are interested to fight international terrorism, etc. And a very interesting issue is the climate change. And I think Russia is the country most benefiting by climate warming. Because Russia has really some real advantages in this aspect, and for the foreseeable future, Russia could become really one of the major exporters of food, of fresh water, etc. Today, Russia is exporting oil, gas, uranium, and timber. Why not completing the whole cycle? Meaning that, for instance, the capture and storage of CO2. This will, by the way, a very profitable business. Billions of business of profits are possible in this respect. And if Russia creates, together with the European Union, a strategy on that, the same in forestation, etc. So I think this is not a toxic and, so to say, a toxic political area. And what Fedor rightly said, business people are ahead of politicians today. So why not ask the business community to go along with these ideas? The same with uranium. So the reprocessing and all these things, this is something where Russia has the knowledge, has the possibility, has the ability, etc. So I think as a stubborn, not optimist or pessimist, but possibilist, I really think, how can we make it possible to reevaluate and to reinvigorate the idea of a greater Europe? No illusions. So the old saying of Romano Prodi, EU and Russia shares everything but institutions, this is over. And Russia will, as Fedor said it, everybody is now looking for its own interests and own policy. Okay, that's for sure. But what we really need is a new balance, and nobody is interested. We are not interested to be, so to say, the followers just of the Americans. Look to Nord Stream 2 sanctions, etc., and other sanctions. During the last years, we had 2,800 different individual sanctions against companies, against persons by the Americans. Most of them, by the way, Europeans. So this is not our way. So being a follower, just a follower, this is not our main task. The same is, by the way, for Russia. Right? Russia cannot be, so to say, just the junior partner for China. So there is a common and a significant interest for all of us to cooperate in an independent but partnerly way. And this is, by the way, the task for the next 5 years. You are right, Markus, these are important years. We should use the opportunity with Ursula von der Leyen on one side and Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin on the other side. There is room to cooperate, and we should make it possible. Thank you.
Спасибо большое, Вольфганг. Во-первых, спасибо за огромную работу, которая проделана десятилетиями в рамках диалога Европа-Россия.
Thank you very much, Wolfgang. I would like to thank you for all your efforts in terms of your input into Russia-EU dialogue. And thank you for finding this elegant solution to the Russian identity crisis, given the opportunity for the business people to step in. Now I would like to give the floor to Andrei Kortunov, Director General of Russian International Affairs Council, one of the biggest think tanks in the Russian Federation. Thank you. I'm going to set my timer on. So, we are speaking about the greater Europe. I think that here we need to look back at how we tried to build the greater Europe. In fact, over the last 30 years, we saw 3 attempts of creating the institutional basis for the greater Europe. We can be looking at the possibility of building the greater Europe in the 90s on the basis of the European institutions, OSCE, the Paris Charter. It hasn't flown. We can find various reasons why, but it hasn't. The second opportunity is given Russia a special status in its cooperation with the main Western institutions, the EU, with the NATO in the format Russia-NATO Council. We had roadmaps, the summit in St. Petersburg, but all that hasn't succeeded, again, for various reasons. There was yet a third attempt to build the greater Europe on the basis of two platforms, the Eastern and the Western. Economically speaking, those are the European Union and the European Economic Union in the format the NATO and OSCE. But unfortunately, it hasn't come true either. If we had a chance of creating the greater Europe comparable to China or the US at all, we have lost it. We can argue whether we had it or not. I think we had it. And I think it was lost because of numerous mistakes made by various parties. Right now we are driving towards the multipolar world. The factors that are playing into it are tied to the new technologies. Some of them are related to economics and politics, and the ambassador of Argentina present here will witness that tango is a dance that is not to be danced by male partners only, so we need various partners to play in, and we need to work with the Asian countries a lot. Unfortunately, I do not see how we can reopen and try again building the greater Europe on the basis of European institutions. I think we need to go away from the European institutions, regimes and strict mechanisms. We need to prevent the multipolar world factors drive us to the same rigid unipolar or bipolar world. So what can we do about the situation that we have today? I will probably repeat the ideas that were already said by my colleagues. I think that we need to keep what we have and what we can. We have areas of cooperation that are very successful. They are based on those old regimes. A classic example here is the Bologna process. It was tested successfully by the Ukrainian crisis, and it is still going on. Not without any problem, but still. Another thing, we can look at the areas not necessarily inside the European space. We can look at the area where the potential of the European Union and Russia are complementary. We have another possibility of working in the Middle East area, but not only there. I think we can be very successful in cooperating in the African region. We can cooperate in the Arctic as well, but we shouldn't go for strict and rigid institutional mechanisms. Yet another thing, we should look at the areas where we luckily escaped from over-politicizing. And here, one of those clean areas is, for example, the 5G technology area. There, we can see new stakeholders, those that we lack. and that we could rely on building new positive relationships between us. So, drawing the line right, the world is drifting towards the bipolar format, but we should not be just the audience watching this tango played by two superpowers. We should take an active part in building the new world, and we shouldn't underestimate it. Thank you very much. Very optimistic, one of the biggest and major think tanks. Valentina, you offered us as a host to save time and skip your presentation, but of course we cannot go without giving a floor to a woman, Dean of the Faculty of Foreign Regional Studies and the Regional Administration. Right, I also thought about the idea of tango. Let's think of its origin. Actually, originally, this dance was danced by two male partners, only. This is a dance of gangsters, and Mr. Ambassador will not allow me to lie. You see, Mr. Lukianov, you started this discussion and now we're talking about gangsters. Okay, in fact, I'm working with the matters that are looking out to the future, because we are training experts in international relationships, and I would like to talk, in fact, about working with the youth. Okay, we have the situation of today, but it is important to look at the future, because right now we are training and giving education to the youth who are going to be making decisions in terms of their relationships with Europe. We are working with our students here. We are sending them to take part in various educational programs in European universities and institutions, and I see that the Russian youth is very open to international cooperation. Another thing, that the Russian youth and Russian young people are very objective in terms of their assessment of the international situation. They are open to cooperation, and it is interesting that the European students are very often thinking using the categories of the Cold War. The majority of European students that come to Russia, very often they are surprised by seeing a different Russia, different from what they expected. Professors of European universities are very often talking the language of the Cold War. And very often they are very surprised, the students are very surprised what is taught at the faculties of politology and political science in other countries. Here it is very important to talk about the cooperation instruments. First of all, in the context of contacts between the youth. In Europe, this process is very well settled. There are many funds that facilitate student exchanges. They have the Erasmus programs and many others. Unfortunately, in the Russian Federation, we do not have such resources, and we have a number of restrictions that make the Russian education less attractive. First of all the complications of obtaining a visa. Then a difficulty to get a work permit in Russia. There is a very limited number of programs taught in various languages, namely in English. And another weak point is the lack of efforts in popularization of the Russian language. And here we have a very good example in terms of the Confucius Institute, the Chinese one. I know that there are many institutes of Confucius, and that has branch offices in various in various countries. I know that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs work a lot in terms of popularization of the Russian language. It is our future. If we do not give an opportunity for the young people to communicate, to build new models, new formats of professional competences, they will not be able to make decisions that will facilitate further international cooperation in the future. Sorry, I have to leave right now because I need to meet other participants. Thank you for finding the time to visit this session.
Last two speakers. We're going to turn first to Daniel Tashis, who is a professor at Stockholm University and was the Secretary General of the Council of Europe. And then we'll go to distinguished Italian economist Franco Bruni. But Daniel first.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me here. The topic may seem a bit ironic. I mean, in a fortnight, the European Union is supposed to shrink to lose one with members. Of course, as anybody knows, the kind of step that is taken is not the end of the UK's involvement in Europe at all. Brexit is a very long road, in my view, leading to nowhere. And the connections in Europe will remain. Endless negotiations are following endless negotiations and are likely to do so in the future as well. But what we see is, I think, a very interesting educational effect of Brexit. No political party in Europe nowadays wants to leave the European Union. We had a couple of parties before that wanted to get out of the European Union. Today, no serious party, not even the extreme parties, are convinced that it's necessary to remain in the European Union. However much they dislike elements in it, and of course everybody has criticisms, there is now more agreement on the need for for the European Union than before. And I think this is a realization of the fact that there is simply no independence or national sovereignty or absolute national sovereignty in a modern world. We have gone through a process of globalization, a new division of labor that has benefited consumers everywhere. It has not benefited producers everywhere, but all consumers have everywhere benefited from globalization. It has meant lifting billions of people out of extreme poverty in Southeast Asia and in Africa. But for the producers, from the producer side, it has meant a cleavage between people who have gained from globalization and people who have lost from globalization. And we see in all our countries now a new cleavage developing between two different segments of the population. One one segment that is essentially young, urban, well-educated, adaptable, and that can has the skills necessary in the new world. And then another segment that has skills that are becoming obsolescent, whose products are no longer in demand, whose part of the countries are no longer in the center of things, and who suffer from this transformation. And this cleavage is leading also to, has political consequences. The urban, forward-oriented, young, well-educated people are accepting, are drawn, are trying to use the opportunities of this new division of labor in the world, while the others are, you can have very much sympathy with the others, but they are drawn to narratives of nostalgia and looking backwards. You find, I think, in all countries nowadays, a hope, a longing for what Richard Kapuscinski, the Polish journalist, had called the great yesterday. The great yesterday looks different in different countries. In America, it's make America great again. It's the America of manufacturing, of coal production, of like it used to be. In my country, Sweden, it's the classical welfare society, how the welfare society looked like before there were any immigrants, supposedly better. In Britain, of course, it's the empire or the Great Britain of old times, when, according to one definition, when the faces were white, passports were blue, and the map of the world was pink. The Great Britain was all over the place. This is the great yesterday in Britain. In this country, I don't know whether it's Tsarist empire, certain periods of the Soviet history. For the time being, it seems to be the Great Patriotic War. I mean, the great yesterday is fluid. You may choose different references for the great yesterday, but the great yesterday has a particular appeal to people who are not so hopeful about the future. And it has been able to unite political movements all over Europe, and not only in Europe, but in America as well, in other parts of the world. And we see this, I think, as a great dilemma now, that nostalgia, sometimes aggressive nostalgia, sometimes just sentimental nostalgia, has a great traction, a great attractive power in many parts of the world. Now, I personally am convinced that in this tension, I wouldn't call it a conflict, but in this tension between the young and the old, the young will prevail. I mean, you can say that just biological reasons for that. The young have an upper hand. And what kind of dance it is, I don't know. I mean, we have more and more moved into choreographic discussions here about different dances. But the young dancers have a tendency, I think, to prevail over the old dancers in the long run. And I think that what we have to do is to explore ever deeper forms of cooperation in Europe and elsewhere. We will have to. We have some of the instruments already. Some are good, some are not so strong, but we will have to explore more such instruments. And the idea of national sovereignty, of absolute national sovereignty, is simply not a solution, because so much has been gained by the globalization of our economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel Tages. Let's go to Franco Bruni.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Well, the relationship between the European Union and Russia has gone through a zigzag path, I would say, passing in the last 3 decades from positive to negative periods and vice versa. However, the idea of a greater Europe has always been around. 2004, for instance, wasn't a period of very positive relationship between the EU and Russia. But in April of that year, Vladimir Putin said, and I quote, "We are in favor of a united Europe, and in this spirit, I would not protest if sometime in the future Brussels became our common capital." I mean, isn't it impressive? Therefore, in spite of the fact that the relationship is currently a rather troubled one, there is no reason, I think, to forget the possibility of moving some steps towards the idea of greater Europe. And let me be minimalist, really, and mention 2 pragmatic steps that could be done also very quickly in a way, and that are, I think, a natural priority for talks between Russia and Europe now. I know that my country is currently pushing in this direction. First, the restoration of the visa dialogue, which was interrupted by the EU in 2014 following the Ukraine crisis. And second, the restoration of the EBRD financing to small and medium-sized Russian firms, which was a very successful program, which was also interrupted with what I think is an extensive interpretation of the sanctions of 2014. I believe both steps are worth a reinterpretation of the sanctions by the EU. The visa is a crucial people-to-people issue, and Valentina was mentioning other people-to-people issues that are important. And I think that the dialogue should start from people to people. And also, in a way, the SMEs financing can be thought as something having substantial people-to-people, B2B meaning. Let me add now a more general consideration. This is a period where powerful nationalisms, as many have observed, try to dominate global governance and kill multilateral cooperation. Consider four main actors of the geopolitical game power: USA, China, the EU, and Russia. Each of them has important controversies with each of the others. There is often the presumption that a weak integration of the EU is a good thing for the other three. A more divided Europe would favor the power of the other big protagonists of the global game. This idea is reinforced by the fact that each of these other protagonists, in particular the USA and Russia, to a lesser extent China, has been acting during the last years to deepen as much as possible the divisions inside the EU, also by siding in various ways with those political forces that in EU's member states have nationalistic and Eurosceptic attitudes. There is obviously some truth in the idea that a weaker Europe favors the other big powers. However, for these powers, divisions inside the EU have both benefits and costs. And the costs can sometimes be larger than the benefits. Consider first the economic dimension of the actors. A divided EU plays the geo-economic game in a divided setting, so that what really counts is the GDP of each member state. Compared to a better integrated Europe, the GDP-driven powers, let's call it this way, of the other actors obviously increase. But the importance of this benefit, I would say it's different for US, China, and Russia. While the US GDP is approximately the same as Europe's, while China is bigger in PPP terms, using purchasing power exchange rates, Russia is a little smaller than Germany, while at market exchange rates it's less than half of Germany, 80% of Italy, 60% of France. Therefore, the increase in the relative economic power of Russia when the EU shows its divisions is much smaller than in the case of the US and China. From this point of view, US and China would gain relative power over Russia by dominating the divided European countries. Moreover, integrated and competitive EU's goods, services, labor, and capital markets can be a resource for Russia much more than for the other two. Moreover, and I finish here, using game and contract theory, I would say that in general terms, a non-fully cooperative game with three actors is more difficult and dangerous to play than a game with four actors. When the actors are three and two of them coalesce, the third is isolated. On the contrary, when the actors are four, a coalition of two of them is easier to form than a coalition of three, leaves each of the other two with the more strategic opportunities, including the formation of defensive coalition. In a world where many talk of a G2 governance, with the US and China keeping hostile and nationalistic attitudes, but joining forces to set the global stage in their favor, a greater Europe can be a good thing for Russia and Europe. And however, this greater Europe, I think, and this is my main message, I think it's impossible without strengthening the European integration and enlargement. And this is the reason why I think Russia should be one of the main supporters of the unification, the stronger unification of Europe. It's in the deep interests of Russia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Franco Bruni. Now, before handing over to Igor to throw the debate open, I want to just pick up on a couple of points. First, Valentina Komleva mentioned the Cold War, and I think she's got it right. I think we have to prick the balloon of the Cold War once and for all. And I have to say, living in Brussels, it's not an EU problem, it's a NATO problem. NATO finds it very difficult to change its thinking, which may be why Macron said it was brain dead. When Alex Grishko was Russia's ambassador to NATO, we met quite frequently for informal chats. And as I recall, Alex, we were agreed that Russia and Europe had many shared security concerns, whether they were migration, Islamic militancy or whatever, and that we had increasingly fewer contentious areas. And I was listening to what we've been talking about today, and I was thinking, what are the shared interests of, shall we call it, Greater Europe Mark II? Because I certainly don't retract what I said at the beginning. Greater Europe as a sort of conversation has gone on too long and got nowhere. But let's talk about Greater Europe Mark II. What do we share? First of all, we are shrinking, both Russia and Europe. We are shrinking, and numbers really count. Look at America, it's growing. Look at China, it's grown. Second, we share a vulnerability on our high-tech technological weaknesses. And this is going to hurt very hard in the next 20 or 30 years. We have no option but to start working together at an academic and research level, but also in the marketplace. Third thing, what do we share? Falling living standards. Europe's living standards are falling. That's why we have populism. I'm not going to make any remarks about populism in the Russian Federation, but your living standards are falling. So where does that take us? It seems to me that Chancellor Schussel was right. We're not superpowers. We're not going to be superpowers. But together, we are going to be neutral, honest, and respected. And that is powerful currency in geopolitics. And I think we should be looking for ways to cooperate, but also we should be looking at unholy alliances. If the big problem is climate change and the mass movement of people prompted by climate change, let's look at one of the biggest unholy alliances. It's made up of Russia, the United States, China, Poland, and Australia. And it's a coal alliance. These are the guys digging coal, selling coal, and creating power stations in third world countries to burn coal. And I think one of the first things we should be doing on the climate change front is to try and destroy unholy alliances. Igor.
Спасибо большое. Я, чтобы, так сказать, оставить место.
Thank you. Just to leave some room for a couple of questions, I would mention that the most important thing in our discussion so far has been the basis for our potential and actual cooperation. Mr. Grishko, Lukyanov, and Chancellor Shusal have been mentioning that. And we are talking about industrial cooperation, entrepreneurial or business cooperation, something that has not been actually impeded by political efforts, both on a bilateral basis or as part of the roundtable discussion, Russian business versus European business. Being economic determinists, we believe that the basis would sometimes define the relationship within the supreme structure. We further believe that cooperation between Europe and Russia on a basic level should continue. Well, since we're using Marxist terminology now, I would recall Mr. Tremonti has mentioned a paramount Marxist idea that the zero growth is the end of capitalism. And the end of capitalism means the advent of a next model. And everybody is talking about that. Klaus Schwab offered about 10 years ago that we migrate from the shareholders' capitalism to the stakeholder capitalism. And this idea is being promoted so much. Well, those who read the most recent Come On may recall that the capitalism is already over because we are sucking out much more from the planet that we infuse into it. I believe that the RANEPA management and the Gaidar Forum organizers will give us better opportunities to talk more and to exchange more ideas in the future. I do hope that the future of the European capitalism, we're living under European capitalism, whether we are being in Russia or elsewhere. I believe that this is something that could bring us together. And I believe that we could talk much more on that agenda. And I believe that in Fodor and others and our outfit could actually compile a new paper for the future participants in the Gaidar Forum so that they could get thoroughly prepared. Although this has been a very interesting discussion indeed. And this brings me to the end of my remarks. And we have some minutes, thanks to the disciplined speakers, to open up the floor for Q&A or comments. So I believe we have microphones around, roving microphones. Are there any? Yes, there are. So please go ahead. You can raise your hand and ask your question. Please tell us who you want to ask a question. If there are no questions, then we can make a political statement of sorts. So there are no questions. Okay, comments. Alexander Grishko, you have an opportunity to make a comment or two. Very, very quickly. It would be so interesting to launch a second round of comments. I would venture to counter what Andrei has said here about the missed opportunities. Being professional politicians and political analysts, I believe that there are some missed opportunities in the parks, and the windows of opportunities opened in the past are now closed. And to reopen them again, this will take so much political will, which is simply unavailable at the moment. I believe that the greater Europe fell under the onslaught of those who advocated the end of history and source of political legitimacy. No one has the right to question the actions of NATO on the world arena. No talk about international law. Do not expand NATO. We came to say, do not try to squeeze the spring, because it will then spring back at you.
The second thing that I wanted to say, actually, today it looked like me and Marcus, we were arguing because he was appealing to me in his very diplomatic manner, very professionally, and I'm being very serious. I mean it. But there was one thing that jerked upon my ear. The thing is that many people in the West, they think that the relationships between Russia and China are very much dependent between the relationship between Russia and the West. They think that if the relationships between the West and Russia improve, the relationship between Russia and China will change. In fact, it is not so. Our strategy in terms of our relationships with China are long-term. The strategy is long-term, and the relationships are independent. They're independent from what people think about these relationships in the West. I already mentioned the principles that Europe implements building the relationships with Russia. In fact, we offered the European Union open a dialogue on very specific issues that are of great importance to both parties. There are areas where the dialogue is happening. There are other areas, but we are very open in terms of working on building this dialogue. However, an important thing here is that a big block of Russian-European relationships is dependent on the Minsk format and the Minsk agreements. However, the Ukrainian party does not respect the Minsk agreement, and unfortunately here we have to stick to our position. If the EU chooses to talk to us only and open the dialogue only in terms of the issues that are of interest for the European Union, we are going to do the same, because as we've already said many times today, it takes two to tango. Yet another thing that I want to mention, I would like to thank Charles for reminding me of this matter very elegantly. The thing is that if the military development that NATO is performing today, if it will be happening along the rules of the Cold War, if the weapon race is going to continue, and NATO will be mirroring the military activity of Russia, if Europe will be used as a basis, no greater European project is possible, because this is the basis of everything. Well, as we have talked about choreography so much, I cannot but give the floor to Marcus Ederer, because we need to watch this male tango between Grishko and Ederer.
Can dance tango, she would say no. And so maybe I suggest in the presence of the Austrian ambassadors that we switch to waltz.
Slow waltz.
Slow waltz, slow waltz. Yeah, even my wife would believe that I can do slow waltz. No, I mean, this has been a rare occasion where indeed Alexander and I almost read from the same sheet, and what he said at the end, I think, is to be taken very seriously. Some of you know that I do not only believe that this is not a new Cold War, it is actually a situation which is potentially much more dangerous than the Cold War. The Cold War was much more, produced much more stability and predictability than what we have now. And if you need an ultimate proof that this is not the Cold War but possibly worse, is that during the Cold War we agreed all these arms control deals, which we are all throwing under the bus today. So this is a situation which is actually more dangerous than the Cold War. And that is true for the European continent, but We should also see that while we all believe that climate change and digitalization is now dictating our life for the next 30 years, I think the questions of war and peace are back. And we were reminded of that over the new year with a close call between Iran and the United States. So, I mean, there's a lot to do between Russia and us Europeans in the EU to work on these big construction sites. As I said, the Greater Europe is an unattended construction site. I believe workers have moved on to the extension of a construction site, which Russia calls Greater Eurasia. But I would also remind you that the European Union is the biggest trading partner of China. And by the way, also of the United States. So there is some potential also to become a player, even in other fields. Last remark, coming back to what Franco Bruni said, my experience having served in China, in Russia, and for the German government being an operator in the transatlantic relationship, it's not as easy as saying that the big powers want to divide us. My experience is that the big powers want us to be united against the other ones. So the Chinese would have liked us very much to stand up with them against the United States. And I think this is also what Russia is sometimes calling for. Whereas the United States, in my experience as State Secretary, would like us to be united against Russia and China. And one way of doing this is they try to divide us. Remember Rumsfeld's Old Europe, New Europe? I mean, the rhetoric is we want a united Europe, but the practice is, of course, to divide us. And I'm not even holding it against these big powers. I think it's our job to be united and not to be vulnerable against these kinds of pressure attempts. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marcus. Thank you to everybody. I just want to add a final thought. And it's about time, not about the time for the discussion. It's about time in general. It's not on our side. The last year has seen enormous shifts between that Chinese and American relationship. Moves around all over the place, but the general direction of travel is clear. I was here a year ago. In Russia and Europe, nothing has changed. We are not moving. And I think we really have to accelerate our pace of discussing between Russia and Europe what we want, as Alex was saying, what we want to give, how to do it. For the last, I set up a think tank in Brussels called Friends of Europe 20 years ago. For the last 10 years, I've been trying to get off the ground a Russian-European dialogue. I've totally failed. Nobody was interested. Nobody would help pay for it. Nobody wanted to take the risk. Well, it strikes me that today I have Andrei Kortunov sitting over there, Fyodor Lukyanov over there, Valdai, and the most powerful of the Russian think tanks. Can we sit down and talk about something that would maybe twice a year go from Brussels to Moscow, Moscow to Brussels, so that we could have an ongoing conversation instead of an hour and a half once a year? It's a question. Meanwhile, Igor, thank you.
Спасибо большое. К сожалению, наше время...
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. And right now, I would like to address the participants that spoke today. RANEPA and the Gaidar Forum, they are publishing a report, a publication as a result of every year's forum. Last year, we urged upon all the speakers to contribute their notes, their speeches. Last year, that didn't happen. I saw that our Italian colleagues have some notes and Russian speakers have some notes. Please send them to me, because the RANEPA will use these speeches. We will collect all the speeches and presentations, and as a result we get a very interesting scientific almanac. All the others who can and want to contribute, I'm sure that if Marcus, for example, Japan, his people in the embassy, they will be able to give the notes and the speech to us as well. All the others, please do send me your materials, your documents, and we will use it. Thank you very much. We are moving on. I think we are moving on because last year we sounded much more pessimistic. Today, some, including me, are talking about the light at the end of the tunnel. Although Wolfgang criticized me, he says that there is a train there. But thank you very much.